The spirit of Mairia. Did you go drinking again, Nando? Why didn't you invite us to join you? The sarcastic voice came from inside a small water stall. The Nando being addressed was an old man, nearly 60, who was staggering along the road outside. His steps were unsteady, clearly drunk from the afternoon's indulgence. He slurred back, his voice thick with the stench of alcohol. "Come to my house and I'll give you a whole barrel. Nando here lacks nothing. Why wouldn't I treat you all to a round?" Nando's words were followed by a violent gagging sound as he bent over to vomit. The people inside the stall immediately turned their heads away in disgust. The one who had spoken earlier, Javier, let out a loud laugh. "Ha ha! Everyone knows what your house is like, old man. Stop pretending. Go home and sleep it off before you stink up the whole tea shop." Whether Nando heard or not, no one could tell, but he shot Javier a sharp look before stumbling off, muttering under his breath, "You'll all be sorry. Just wait and see." Once Nando's figure disappeared from view, the group in the shop resumed their merry chatter and drinking. Everyone in the village knew old Nando as a heavy drinker, but he wasn't always like that. In his younger days, Nando had been well liked for his strength and hard work. He was the go-to man whenever someone needed help, but his ugly appearance and poor background meant no one wanted to marry him. It wasn't until he turned 30 that his life took an unexpected turn. One night, while hunting in the mountains, he stumbled upon a young woman trapped in a deep pit, calling out in desperation, "Help! Somebody help me!" Nando rushed to the edge of the pit and saw the girl lying there, weak and barely conscious. He quickly grabbed a nearby vine, tossing it down and shouting, "Hey, hold on to the vine! I'll pull you up." The girl, despite her exhaustion, clung to the vine, and after a while, Nando managed to hoist her to safety. Looking her over, he asked kindly, "What were you doing out here so late? What's your name?" The girl, with a voice full of sorrow, replied, "My name is Mairia. I live in the next village. I came to the mountain to gather herbs for my sick father, but I fell into this pit. Thank you so much for saving me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." Nando waved her off modestly. "It's nothing. If you trust me, I can take you to the village healer. Your leg looks badly injured." Without hesitation, Mairia agreed and followed Nando. Thanks to his help, not only did she recover, but her father's health also improved. Out of gratitude, Mairia started visiting Nando regularly, helping him with chores around the house. Though Nando was embarrassed and tried to dissuade her, Mairia insisted, "It's because of you that my father is getting better. Let me repay you." News of Nando saving Mairia spread quickly, and while many in the village admired him, some young men mocked him for being unworthy of such a beautiful girl. Mairia was fair-skinned and in the bloom of her youth, while Nando was large and strong but dark-skinned with a long scar across his face from a fall. One day, tired of the gossip, Nando said to Mairia, "You've probably heard the rumors. I don't care what they say about me, but it's unfair to you. Maybe you should stop coming here and just take care of your father." Mairia, who was cleaning the wooden table, sighed and replied, "Are you saying I'm bothering you?" "No, not at all. It's just, it doesn't feel like my house when you're here. It feels like I'm in someone else's home." She looked at him and, with a serious tone, asked, "Then, do you not want to marry me?" Nando's heart skipped a beat. Over 30 years without a single matchmaker, and here was this beautiful girl asking to marry him. Surely he must be dreaming. He stammered, What did you say?" Mairia smiled and gently placed her hand on his face. "I'm serious. If you don't mind, will you marry me? My parents have already agreed." Stunned, Nando could only nod. Their wedding was small but stirred up the entire village. Some raised glasses in celebration, while others whispered insults behind their backs. Though Nando was initially embarrassed, Maria's encouragement gave him the confidence to enjoy the festivities. What seemed like a fairy tale, however, was soon shattered. A few months after their marriage, Nando's behavior changed. He became consumed with jealousy, fearing he would lose Mairia. When he saw her laughing and talking with other men, he grew angry. One night, after Mairia returned home from the market, Nando exploded in a fit of rage, accusing her of infidelity. "Who were you with? Who are you sneaking around with behind my back? I went to the market. Why don't you believe me?" Nando, reeking of alcohol, didn't listen. He slapped Maria across the face, sending her sprawling to the ground. "You liar! They saw you with another man." Maria wept, pleading her innocence, but Nando was too blinded by his jealousy. He kicked her in the stomach, and the neighbors, hearing her screams, rushed over. They were horrified to see Maria lying in a pool of blood. "She's pregnant. What have you done?" they shouted. Nando froze. Pregnant, but instead of feeling joy, his jealousy only deepened. "What if it's not mine? You must have been with someone else." Days later, Maria disappeared. Despite the villagers' efforts to find her, she was gone. Nando, now sober, realized the horror of what he had done, but it was too late. That night, under the ancient balete tree at the edge of the village, they found her. Maria had hanged herself, her white dress fluttering in the wind, her long hair cascading down her back. Her once beautiful face was now pale, her tongue protruding from her mouth and her neck stretched unnaturally. Her tragic death drove Nando mad. Consumed by guilt, he drowned himself in alcohol, trying to forget the nightmare he had caused. As for the three men who had teased Nando and stoked his jealousy, Javier, Tomas, and Lando, they were terrified when they heard about Maria's death. But life went on. They continued their petty gossip and taunted Nando about the past, never imagining the consequences that awaited them. Nearly 35 years passed. The trio never changed their ways. One night, after another round of mocking Nando, they laughed uproariously. Javier, with his bushy beard, pointed at Nando, saying, "What a pathetic fool, letting a woman ruin his life." They drank and laughed, oblivious to the cold wind that had begun to stir outside. Later that night, by the same balete tree where Maria had died, a man carrying a sack stopped. He looked up and, in a voice as cold as death, whispered, "Are you waiting for your mother?" The wind howled, and a childlike voice answered, "Sir, please help my mother." The man smiled grimly and with a wave of his hand chanted something under his breath. The night air shimmered, and the man walked away, leaving behind a whisper, "Vengeance will be served, but let her spare the innocent." Two ghostly voices echoed in the wind. "Thank you, master." And then the vengeful spirit of Maria and her unborn child awoke, ready to claim justice. The following morning, a scream pierced the air. Javier, Tomas, and Lando had been found dead, their bodies hanging from the balete tree, just as Maria had been. Their faces were twisted in terror, their eyes wide open in their final moments of fear. The village was haunted by the events that unfolded. People whispered of curses and spirits, of justice served from beyond the grave. And as for Nando, the once broken man, he stopped drinking. He spent the rest of his days quietly helping those around him, trying in vain to atone for the sins of his past. The legend of Maria, Nando, and the three men became a chilling reminder to the villagers, a tale of revenge, regret, and the price of evil deeds. Years passed, but the memory of Maria's death never truly faded from the village. Her tale was passed from one generation to the next, becoming something of a dark legend. People would often lower their voices whenever they spoke of Nando or the balete tree, fearful that even mentioning it might bring Maria's vengeful spirit to their doorstep. Nando lived a life of solitude. He no longer drank, but that didn't mean the guilt had left him. Every night he would sit by his small window, staring into the darkness, hoping for a sign, hoping for something, anything, that would give him peace. But the haunting memory of Maria's lifeless body hanging from the balete tree never left his mind. One stormy evening, as thunder rumbled through the village, Nando found himself unable to sleep. The rain pelted his roof like angry fists, and the wind howled through the cracks in his home. He tossed and turned in his bed, but his mind kept drifting back to Maria. The guilt was suffocating, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at his door. Nando's heart skipped a beat. He froze in place, listening. The knock came again, soft but insistent. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The knock came a third time, louder now. His heart racing, Nando slowly got out of bed and approached the door, his hands trembling. As he reached for the doorknob, he hesitated. Something deep inside him screamed not to open it, but he couldn't stop himself. With a deep breath, Nando flung open the door, and there, standing in the pouring rain, was Maria. She looked exactly as she had the night she died. Her white dress was soaked through, her long hair clinging to her face and shoulders, but it was her eyes that terrified him the most, empty, lifeless, filled with an unearthly glow. "Maria," Nando gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Maria didn't speak. She simply stood there, staring at him, her lips twisted into a cold, bitter smile. Her eyes never left his, as if they could see straight into his soul. And in that moment, Nando knew. Maria had come back for him. "I'm sorry," he stammered, taking a step back. "I'm so sorry, for everything." Still, she said nothing. Instead, she lifted one pale hand and pointed towards the balete tree, where it all had begun. The wind picked up, howling louder than before, as if urging Nando to follow her. Terrified but powerless to resist, Nando grabbed his coat and stepped out into the storm. He followed Maria as she drifted silently through the village, her feet never touching the ground. They passed through the narrow streets, the rain pounding down on them, but Nando barely noticed. His eyes were locked on Maria, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Finally, they reached the balete tree, its twisted roots and gnarled branches looming ominously in the darkness. The lightning illuminated the scene briefly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the ground. Maria stopped beneath the tree, her ghostly figure blending into the mist that swirled around them. Nando stopped too, just a few feet away, trembling from head to toe. "Maria?" he whispered again, his voice barely audible over the storm. This time she spoke. Her voice was low, hollow, as if it came from the depths of the grave. "You killed me," she said, her eyes boring into his. "And now I've come to take you with me." Nando's legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, clutching his chest in terror. "Please, forgive me," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was jealous. Please, Maria." Maria tilted her head, her cold smile widening. "It's too late," she whispered. "There is no forgiveness, not for you." With those words, she began to move towards him, her arms outstretched, her fingers like icy claws reaching for his throat. Nando tried to crawl away, but his body was frozen with fear. The closer she got, the colder the air became, until it felt like he was suffocating beneath the weight of her presence. And then, just as her fingers brushed his skin, there was a blinding flash of light. Nando cried out, shielding his eyes from the brightness. When the light faded, Maria was gone. In her place stood a tall figure in a dark cloak, his face hidden beneath a hood. The stranger stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "It is not your time yet, Nando," the man said, "but Maria's soul will not rest until justice is done." Nando, still trembling, looked up at the figure in disbelief. Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he gestured towards the balete tree, where something strange was happening. The tree's roots began to twist and writhe as if they were alive, and from the ground, a faint light began to glow. The figure turned back to Nando and spoke one final time. "You cannot undo the past, but you can atone for your sins. Find peace, Nando, for Maria and for yourself." With that, the figure disappeared into the storm, leaving Nando alone beneath the balete tree. The storm began to die down, the wind and rain easing into a gentle drizzle. Nando slowly got to his feet, staring at the spot where Maria had stood just moments before. He knew now what he had to do. From that night on, Nando devoted his life to making amends for the wrongs he had done. He visited the graves of those he had wronged, tending to them with care and leaving offerings in their memory. He helped the villagers in any way he could, offering his strength and wisdom to anyone in need. Though the guilt still weighed heavily on his heart, Nando found some measure of peace in his acts of kindness. As for the village, the story of Maria and Nando became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of jealousy and the importance of forgiveness. And though Maria's spirit was never seen again, some say that on stormy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice in the wind, calling out for justice. And the balete tree, with its twisted roots and haunting presence, still stands at the edge of the village, a silent witness to the tragedy that unfolded beneath its branches all those years ago. As the years passed, the legend of Maria and the balete tree grew darker, transforming into a tale that both haunted and intrigued the villagers. Some said that the tree had become cursed, its roots soaked in the blood of Maria's untimely death. No one dared to go near it after dark. Even during the day, children would avoid playing near it, fearful of the eerie whispers that the wind carried through its twisted branches. But despite Nando's attempts to atone for his past, the weight of what he had done never left him. His dreams were filled with Maria's cold, accusing eyes, and even during the day he often thought he saw her figure lurking in the shadows, watching him with that same bitter smile. One night, years after the terrible events that had unfolded, Nando lay in bed, unable to sleep. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and not a single sound could be heard from the village outside. He tossed and turned, the familiar guilt gnawing at him. His thoughts drifted back to the night Maria had died, the night he had driven her to such despair with his uncontrollable jealousy. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through his small home, blowing out the candle by his bedside. Nando sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence that followed was deafening, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. There it was again, a soft knock at the door. Nando's hands trembled as he got out of bed, fear tightening its grip around his heart. He knew deep down what awaited him on the other side of the door. This time, it was different. This time, there would be no reprieve. With shaky hands, Nando opened the door, and there she was, Maria, standing in the pale moonlight, her white dress shimmering like a ghostly apparition. Her hair flowed like a dark river, framing her face, and those eyes, those cold, unforgiving eyes, pierced through the darkness, locking onto his. "Maria," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But her presence was suffocating, the coldness of her spirit enveloping Nando like an icy fog. He fell to his knees before her, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry," he cried, his voice breaking. "Please, Maria, forgive me. I never meant for this to happen. I didn't know." But Maria's expression never changed. She remained still, silent, like a statue carved from the shadows of the night. The wind picked up again, swirling around them, and Nando's words were lost in the howling gusts. Then, without warning, Maria took a step forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and Nando felt the ground beneath him tremble with each step she took. His heart pounded louder, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. "You took everything from me," Maria finally whispered high, her voice carrying the weight of years of sorrow and pain. "My life, my child, and for what? For your pride? For your jealousy?" Nando sobbed, unable to look up at her. He couldn't bear the weight of her words, couldn't face the truth of what he had done. "I was wrong," he choked out. I was scared." Maria's eyes narrowed, her voice growing colder, harsher. "Scared?" she spat. "You were selfish. You destroyed me, Nando, and now it's your turn." She raised her hand, her fingers twisted and ghostly pale, reaching towards him. Nando felt his heart seize in his chest, terror paralyzing him as her cold fingers brushed against his skin. A wave of darkness washed over him, pulling him under, and for a moment he thought this was it. This was how it would all end. But just as Maria's hand closed around his throat, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. Nando gasped, clutching at his neck as the world seemed to spin out of control. The wind howled louder, the trees swayed violently, and the ground split open with a deafening crack. Out of the earth, the twisted roots of the balete tree erupted, snaking their way towards Maria. They wrapped around her ankles, pulling her back, dragging her away from Nando. Maria's eyes widened in shock as she struggled against the roots, but they tightened their grip, pulling her down into the dark chasm that had opened beneath her feet. "No!" she screamed, her voice filled with rage and despair. "No, this isn't over, Nando. This will never be over." The roots continued to drag her deeper into the earth, her voice growing fainter and fainter until finally she disappeared into the black void. The ground trembled one last time before sealing itself shut, leaving no trace of the chasm that had swallowed her. Nando collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His body shook with terror and exhaustion. The wind had died down, and the eerie stillness of the night returned. But just as he thought it was over, just as he began to feel a flicker of hope that he had finally escaped Maria's wrath, a voice whispered in the darkness. "This is not the end." Nando's blood ran cold. He looked around frantically, but there was no one there. The voice echoed through the night, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This is not the end, Nando. I will be back." Terror gripped Nando's heart as he realized the truth. No matter what he did, no matter how much he tried to atone, Maria's spirit would never rest. She would haunt him for the rest of his days, and even in death, he would never escape her. The village remained quiet that night, but the whispers of Maria's revenge spread quickly. People spoke in hushed tones about the strange happenings near the balete tree, and many claimed to have seen Maria's ghost wandering the village, searching for something or someone. Nando knew that his time was running out. He had tried to make peace, but it was too late. The curse that had been set in motion all those years ago could never be undone. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Nando began to feel the weight of his sins bearing down on him. In the end, it wasn't Maria's ghost that claimed him. One cold winter night, Nando was found dead in his bed, his face twisted in terror by his hands clutching his chest. The village mourned his passing, but they all knew the truth. Maria had come for him at last. And even now, years later, the balete tree still stands, a silent reminder of the tragedy that unfolded beneath its branches. Some say that on stormy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear Maria's voice in the wind, calling out for justice, her spirit forever bound to the earth, waiting for the day when she can finally be free. But until that day comes, the village will always live in fear, knowing that the past never truly stays buried, and that sometimes the dead do not rest. The story of Maria and Nando became the very fabric of the village's whispers and warnings. The elders often told the tale to frighten the children, but beneath their words lay a deeper truth, one that the village had come to live with, day by day. Everyone feared the balete tree, and they avoided it at all costs, even though no one had seen Maria's ghost since Nando's death. But some knew that spirits like hers didn't rest so easily. It was a night much like the one when Maria had first appeared to Nando. The air was thick with humidity, and a full moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows on the village below. The wind carried the scent of something old, something forgotten, as it rustled through the balete tree, whose roots had grown even more twisted and knotted over the years. People could feel it, an unnatural energy that clung to the air, like the calm before a storm. 3 young men, bravely or foolishly, decided to venture near the balete tree that night. They had grown up hearing the stories, but like many in their generation, they had become skeptics. To them, it was nothing more than an old ghost story meant to scare kids. "Come on, this is ridiculous," said Rico, the oldest of the 3, laughing nervously as they approached the tree. "It's just a tree. We'll prove once and for all that there's nothing to fear." His friends, Matteo and Jairo, weren't so sure. They'd heard the whispers, the strange noises at night, and though they put on brave faces, their steps slowed as they drew closer to the towering tree. "I don't know, man," Matteo muttered, glancing around nervously. "People have been talking about weird things happening here ever since Nando died." "Yeah," Jairo added. "My grandmother said she saw something under the tree once, a woman in white just standing there." Rico rolled his eyes and kept walking. The tree loomed above them, its massive branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows across the ground. The closer they got, the colder the air became, until their breath came out in misty puffs, despite the warm night. "You see?" Rico called back to his friends. "It's just an old tree. No ghosts, no spirits. We're fine." But even as he spoke, the air around them grew thick with tension. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze moments ago, picked up suddenly, whipping through the branches of the balete tree with a low, ominous howl. The boys exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke, too afraid to acknowledge what they all felt, that something was very, very wrong. As Rico approached the base of the tree, he reached out to touch its gnarled trunk. His hand hovered just inches from the bark when a voice, soft and distant, whispered through the wind, "Leave this place." Rico froze. His hand dropped to his side, and he turned to his friends, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Matteo and Jairo nodded, their eyes wide with fear. They took a few steps back, but Rico stood his ground, trying to convince himself that it was just the wind playing tricks on them. Then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The roots of the balete tree shifted, writhing like serpents beneath the soil, and the wind howled louder as if it were alive, filled with a fury that had been waiting for years to be unleashed. Jairo stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get out of here," he shouted over the roaring wind. But it was too late. From the shadows of the balete tree, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was barely visible, like a mist rising from the ground, but as it drew closer, it took on a more solid form. A woman, draped in white, her long hair flowing in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and she moved with an unnatural grace as if she were floating just above the ground. Mateo gasped, stumbling backward in terror. It's her!" he cried. "It's Mairia!" The boys turned to run, but the ground erupted around them, the roots of the balete tree rising like twisted fingers to block their escape. The woman, Mairia, hovered just above the ground, her cold, lifeless eyes fixed on Rico. "You should not have come here," she whispered, her voice echoing through the night. Rico, frozen in place, couldn't tear his gaze away from her. His heart hammered in his chest as Mairia drew closer, her eyes burning with a vengeful fury. "I was wronged," she hissed, her voice filled with bitterness and sorrow. "Wronged by the living, and now I have come for justice." The air around them grew colder, and Rico's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, stumbling over the roots of the tree. His friends, too paralyzed by fear, could only watch as Mairia reached out towards Rico, her ghostly hand passing through the air like a blade through water. I didn't do anything," Rico stammered, his voice trembling with fear. But Maria's eyes darkened, and her hand shot forward, grabbing him by the throat. Rico gasped, his hands clawing at the icy grip that tightened around his neck, but it was no use. Her strength was otherworldly, far beyond anything he could have imagined. "You carry the sins of the past," Mairia whispered, her voice low and deadly. "And now you will pay the price." Rico's eyes widened in terror as Maria's grip tightened, and his vision blurred. His friends watched in horror, too scared to move, as Mairia lifted Rico off the ground with impossible strength, holding him in the air as his life slipped away. Mateo screamed, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned to run, but the roots of the balete tree snapped up around his ankles, dragging him back towards the tree. He clawed at the ground, his heart pounding in his chest, but it was no use. The roots wrapped around him, pulling him down, deeper into the earth. Jairo, the last of the group, backed away slowly, tears streaming down his face. "Please. We didn't know. We didn't mean." But Maria's gaze fell on him, and with a flick of her wrist, the wind howled louder, and the roots of the balete tree surged up, dragging Jairo into the darkness. As the moonlight bathed the village, the screams of the three boys echoed through the night, swallowed by the shadows of the balete tree. And when morning came, the village was silent.